Imagine standing at the edge of a frozen valley with nothing but a spear made of wood and stone. In front of you is a woolly mammoth, 50 times your body weight, tusks long enough to split a man in half. You are not just hunting it, you are planning to kill it, with a handful of friends and nothing else. Most people assume this was suicide. It wasn't. It was math. The movies love the moment of the throw, a hero, a spear, a roar, a fall, but that single second was the smallest part of the story. The real question isn't how one spear brought down a mammoth, it's how a group of humans with no metal, no horses, and no long-range weapons pulled this off again and again, for thousands of years. Everything that mattered happened long before anyone raised a weapon. It started with watching. Not for hours, but for days, sometimes weeks. Hunters didn't chase mammoths, they studied them. Which ones limped, which ones lagged behind the herd, which ones drank alone at the river's edge while the others grazed uphill. A mammoth wasn't just an animal to these people. It was a puzzle, and the puzzle had a weak point somewhere. Find it, and the impossible became merely difficult. Here's what most people get wrong. Strength didn't win this fight. Patience did. Crush a human skull in one step and barely notice. That's what a healthy adult mammoth was capable of. No spear, no matter how sharp, was changing that equation head-on. So humans didn't fight fair. They never intended to. Every successful hunt began with an unfair advantage, quietly built over days of silent observation. Think about what that takes. No radios, no notes, no maps, just memory, passed between a dozen people, refined every single day. Where the herd slept, where the wind carried scent, which way a frightened mammoth would run when it panicked. Because a panicked mammoth doesn't run randomly, it runs towards safety, and if you already know where that safety is, you don't need to catch the mammoth at all. You need it to run into you. Most documentaries skip this part entirely, probably since it looks boring on camera. There's no blood, no chase, no drama, just people crouched behind rocks for hours, watching an animal chew grass. But this was the part that decided everything. Get the observation wrong, and the rest of the plan collapses before it starts. Trackers learned to read details modern eyes would miss completely. A slight change in how a mammoth placed its weight meant a sore leg. A mammoth standing at the edge of the herd, slightly apart from the rest, might be old, sick, or simply cautious. And cautious mammoths were harder, not easier, to trap. The easiest targets weren't the weakest animals. They were the distracted ones, the ones focused on a rival, a mate, or a stubborn patch of food instead of their surroundings. Picture construction, not a chase. That's what the real hunt actually looked like once the trap was underway. Some hunters built barriers out of branches and stacked stone, subtle enough that a distracted animal wouldn't notice them until it was too late. Others found natural funnels, narrow gaps between rock walls, soft ground that slowed heavy feet, drop-offs hidden by snow. The goal was never to outrun a mammoth. Nobody could outrun a mammoth. The goal was to make the landscape do the running for them. Imagine spending 3 days building a trap an animal might never walk into. That was the gamble every single time. Hours of labor against a single outcome you couldn't control. If the herd changed direction, all of it meant nothing. Often, it did mean nothing. This is a detail most retellings skip entirely. Most attempts failed. Not most days, most individual hunts. The mammoth turned early. The wind shifted and carried human scent forward. A branch snapped at the wrong moment. Weeks of tracking, gone in a heartbeat, and everyone walked back to camp with empty hands and a hungrier winter ahead. Failure wasn't the exception. Failure was the norm hunters trained their entire lives to survive. So when the trap finally worked, when the herd actually turned into the narrow gap between the rocks, something extraordinary happened. Everyone already knew their job. Nobody needed instructions, because the plan had been rehearsed in whispers around a fire the night before. The younger hunters moved first, not to attack, but to be seen. Loud, visible, deliberately reckless along one side of the herd. Their job wasn't killing, their job was steering. A mammoth doesn't think like a predator. It thinks like prey that has never lost before. And prey that has never lost before still knows how to be afraid. As the herd bent away from the noise, exactly where the hunters wanted it to go, older hunters waited in silence. This is the part few people picture correctly. The men and women who threw the first spears weren't the strongest in the group. They were the calmest. Strength gets you nothing if your hands shake at the wrong second. A single mammoth, separated from the herd by fear and geography, finally reached the trap. soft snow over hidden ground, a narrow gap between boulders, a slope steep enough to slow it down but not steep enough to look dangerous. For one crucial moment, the giant that had never needed to be afraid of anything stumbled. That's when the spears came. Not one, many, thrown from multiple angles at once, because a single wound rarely stopped an animal this size. This detail surprises people every time. Ancient hunters weren't trying to land one perfect killing blow like a movie. They were trying to create dozens of small wounds fast enough that blood loss did what raw force never could. It wasn't elegant. It never looked heroic, not the way we imagine it. It was efficient, and efficient is what kept people alive through an ice age. Even after the first wounds landed, the mammoth didn't fall immediately. Sometimes it ran, sometimes it charged. This is the moment every hunter feared most. An injured mammoth, after all, was not a dying mammoth. It was an enraged one, still capable of ending a human life in a single motion. Hunters scattered, regrouped, and closed in again from a different angle. The chase could last minutes. It could last hours. Now picture the sound. Not silence, not triumphant music. Screaming animal, shouting humans, feet pounding through snow, spears splintering against thick hide, blood staining white ground for dozens of meters in every direction. This wasn't a scene. This was chaos being managed by people who had no other option but to manage it. Then, finally, it ended. The ground shook one last time as the animal went down, and the valley went completely silent. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. Nobody cheered. Standing over an animal that could feed an entire group for weeks, the hunters didn't celebrate. They immediately started counting injuries, because a hunt this dangerous rarely ended without cost. Someone limping, someone bleeding, someone who wouldn't fully recover before the next hunt had to happen, whether they were ready or not. Killing a mammoth wasn't a victory in the way we understand victories today. It was a trade. You paid in risk, injury, and sometimes lives, for a return that could keep your entire group alive through winter. Every hunter standing in that valley understood exactly what the price had been, because they'd just watched it happen to the people beside them. Forget bravery. It gets people killed. What actually decided a mammoth hunt was calculation, repeated so many times across so many generations that it eventually looked like instinct. Consider the tools involved. A stone-tipped spear doesn't punch through thick hide easily. Early hunters discovered this the hard way, which is exactly why spear design changed over tens of thousands of years. Wider blades, barbed points that stayed lodged in flesh instead of sliding out. Eventually, spear throwers, simple wooden devices that could launch a spear with far more force than an arm alone. Every improvement existed thanks to a previous version that had failed someone, sometimes fatally. One quiet secret sits behind every successful mammoth hunt in history. Not a single invention, but thousands of small failures, each one making the next generation's hunt slightly less impossible. Now think about coordination. A hunting party wasn't a random group of strong young men grabbing spears and running toward danger. It was structured, sometimes across multiple family groups who barely knew each other, communicating through gesture and inherited knowledge rather than shared language. Someone had to track, someone had to build, someone had to steer the herd, someone had to strike, someone had to watch for danger the group itself hadn't noticed yet. A wounded mammoth was rarely the only threat in that valley. Scavengers noticed blood before humans finished celebrating anything, which meant there was rarely time to celebrate at all. But that's a different story. For now, focus on what actually happened in that moment of the kill. Not the heroic instant Hollywood loves to show you, but the version built from actual evidence. Weeks of tracking, days of trap building, dozens of failed attempts for every successful one. A calculated ambush executed by people who understood fear better than force. An injury-filled chase that could last far longer than anyone wanted. And an ending met not with triumph, but with immediate, practical relief. That relief mattered more than any celebration ever could, because relief meant survival. Triumph is a feeling. Survival is a fact. Ask yourself something most people never consider. If mammoth hunting failed more often than it succeeded, why did humans keep doing it? The answer isn't bravery, and it isn't desperation either. It's the same reason humans still take enormous risks today for enormous rewards. When the payoff is large enough, calculated risk stops looking like recklessness and starts looking like the only rational choice available. Feeding dozens of people for weeks. That's what a single mammoth delivered. No other animal in that landscape offered anything close to that return. Rabbits, foxes, even deer required constant effort for modest reward. A mammoth was different math entirely. One enormous risk traded for weeks of certainty in a world that offered almost none. That's the real reason ancient humans hunted the largest, most dangerous animals on the planet with nothing but wood, stone, and coordination. Not because they were fearless, because they understood something that took modern humans thousands of years to write down in economics textbooks. Sometimes, the biggest risk is the only path to the biggest reward. Every generation that survived a hunt passed something forward that had nothing to do with meat. They passed patience. They passed the discipline to wait 3 days for one opening, instead of forcing a fight they couldn't win. They passed the judgment to know when a wound meant victory and when it meant run. None of that shows up in the fossil record, but all of it is written into why we're still here to ask the question at all. Once the mammoth finally stopped moving, an entirely different kind of danger was just beginning to arrive.